Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is the Deep Dive, where we dig into theological source material and try to pull out the clearest, most compelling insights for you.
That's right. And today we are wrestling with a really magnificent truth.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
We're looking at the structural relationship between God's absolute sovereignty, his infinite happiness, and his drive for self-glory.
And how these three colossal concepts kind of lock together. They form the very basis of Christian hedonism, the idea that our greatest satisfaction is found in God seeking his own.
We've been dissecting material from some key theological writings on this, but we're also paying close attention to the personal story, the spiritual history of Jonathan Edwards.
Yeah, he's a great case study for this. Our mission here is really to show that God's intense focus on himself isn't just, justifiable. It's the bedrock. It's the only thing that human joy and hope can actually stand on.
Right, because if God was anything less than perfectly devoted to his own infinite worth, we'd have nothing stable to trust in.
Nothing at all. So this deep dive, it should really help settle that question of why God's self-focus is actually the greatest news for you.
Okay, so let's unpack this. And I think we should start where all great doctrines really should begin, with a personal internal struggle. These aren't just points on a systematic theology chart, When you take them seriously, they should cause a spiritual and emotional upheaval.
They absolutely should.
And the doctrine of God's total control, his sovereignty, that's often the first point of serious friction for people, isn't it?
It is, for those new to Reformed thought, or even for people who were raised in it. And the biography of Jonathan Edwards gives us this absolutely crucial window into that initial antagonism.
Edwards, here's a man of intense piety, incredible intelligence, even from a young age, and he was deeply, deeply unsettled by the idea of God's total rule.
He was. He recalled that from his childhood, his mind had been full of objections against it, against the idea of God's arbitrary and complete disposal of all things. When he'd run into it in his reading, in preaching, it just created this deep revulsion in him.
It's stunning to read his own words, isn't it? He admits this concept used to appear like a horrible doctrine to him.
A horrible doctrine. And when you read that, you have to stop and ask, why? Why was it horrible? It wasn't just a logical disagreement. It was emotional. He felt it deep in his soul.
So what was the core of it for him? Was it about fairness?
It seems to be, yes.
Yeah.
The difficulty was reconciling God's total control with, the perceived justice of God, especially when it came to salvation and eternal destinations.
Right. For so many people, this doctrine that God has complete uninhibited control over every detail of life and even people's eternal state, it just feels like oppression. It feels arbitrary.
It does. The struggle really kicks in when you hold up that raw, unfiltered assertion of divine control and you realize what it implies. God doesn't just command holiness, he also permits and even decrees that huge amounts of sin and misery exist in the world. He totally controls.
That is the specific perplexity, isn't it? When the sources talk about sovereignty, they mean a control so minute that nothing, not the smallest sin, not the biggest catastrophe, happens outside his permission and his design.
Exactly. So Edwards struggled because he saw the clear commands in Scripture, all the thou shalt nots, and yet he saw history in his own daily life filled with violations of those commands.
And the question that just hangs there is, if God is completely in control, why does he allow the violation of his own law? Or even worse, why does it seem like he structures things so that wickedness advances for a time?
And that's the question that haunted him, and it still haunts us. You have to ask, is God frustrated? Is he sitting up there like a disappointed, melancholy king whose plans are always going wrong?
It creates this intense conflict, intellectually and emotionally. It's the difference between just, acknowledging a philosophical position and really taking that position into our hearts where they belong, as the sources put it.
Right. When you truly grasp the scale of sovereign rule, it causes these upheavals because it challenges our inherent sense of control, our sense of what's fair. It threatens to make God look like a dictator.
A dictator who permits evil just because he can.
But Edwards' personal record, it offers us a way through this. His spiritual autobiography marks a real transformation.
He changes his mind completely.
He becomes convinced and fully satisfied. And the doctrine of God's sovereignty, the very thing that once terrified him, started to appear, in his words, exceeding pleasant, bright, and sweet.
That shift from horrible to sweet is huge. We have to look at what caused that. What was the mechanism of that change? It sounds like it was more than just academic acceptance.
Oh, it was much more than that. It was apprehension. He said the change came when he started to apprehend the justice and reasonableness of it.
So he saw beauty in it.
Yes. He stopped seeing God's sovereignty as just this arbitrary power and started seeing it as the only rightful way for an infinitely worthy being to act. If God is just, he must govern everything. If he is reasonable, his plan must be good, even if we can't see the goodness in every single detail.
And that brought him peace.
A new era of calm and confidence. He found peace in the very idea that had caused him so much distress before. He saw that the absolute disposal of all things by God's own wise will was actually the most praiseworthy thing about the divine king.
Okay, that's a perfect transition, because Edward's resolution really hinges entirely on the nature of the sovereign. To feel that confidence, you have to know that the one in charge is intrinsically happy and good.
Yes.
And this leads us to those three truths that form the structure of God's nature, what we're calling the foundational trinity: sovereignty, happiness, and self-glory. And sovereignty is the starting point, the guarantee that secures the rest.
That's right. Sovereignty isn't just about ownership, it's about absolute effective control. Psalm 115.3 says it so clearly. Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases.
And that's not a passive statement. It's a description of unrestricted right and unrestricted capability. He isn't just observing from the heavens. He's performing every act, permitting every event, all according to his good pleasure.
Yes, and if he does all that he pleases, then the connection between sovereignty and happiness just snaps into focus. It's a logical necessity.
Because if God is truly sovereign, then his purposes can't be frustrated. They can't be thwarted or slowed down or derailed by any creature, human or angelic.
And that is the logical cornerstone of God's necessary happiness. Think about it. If a being had infinite desires but only finite ability to achieve them, that being would suffer infinite frustration.
Of course.
So if God's purposes were constantly falling short, if his will were repeatedly thwarted by rebellious people, he couldn't possibly be a joyful being. He'd be perpetually disappointed or gloomy or irritable.
His happiness would depend on us, on the compliance of finite creatures, which would make his happiness finite and conditional.
But the sources say the opposite is true. Because he is the ultimate sovereign, his plans cannot fail. He must be the happiest of all beings. His sovereignty is the guarantee of his infinite, unshakable happiness.
And that stability is so important for us.
It is. Christian hedonism, the idea that our greatest satisfaction comes from pursuing our joy in God. It's meaningless if the object of our joy is unstable or melancholy. You can't find joy in a frustrated, pouting deity. You need an unshakably happy God.
A happiness that comes from his absolute control over the execution of his good will.
Exactly.
This happiness, though, it isn't just some general sense of well-being. The sources are really specific about defining God's happiness as his delight he has in himself.
Right. It's an internal reality. It flows from his infinite exuberance for his own excellence.
Which moves us to the third point in the structure, the ultimate ground of everything, which is God's self-focus, his glory.
And if God's happiness comes from his own excellence, then the ultimate ground for everything God does, and therefore the stability of our hope, is the fact that God is uppermost in his own affections. He is absolutely devoted to his own worth.
The Westminster Shorter Catechism teaches that man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And the sources we're looking at essentially argue that God's chief end is the same: to glorify God and enjoy himself forever.
It's a parallel idea.
So why is this self-focus, God's allegiance to his own glory, the most secure basis for our hope?
Because it places the objective reality of the universe's greatest good beyond any possibility of compromise. If God's main allegiance were to something finite and changing, like humanity, his plan would lack infinite stability.
It would be contingent.
Exactly. But since God's own glory is the only infinite, eternal, and unchanging reality of worth, his devotion to it ensures that the object of our eventual joy is secure. If he uses all his sovereign wisdom and power to maximize the enjoyment of his own glory, then our rejoicing is guaranteed because we rejoice in him.
Okay, that leads us right into section 3, which this is maybe the most difficult theological concept for someone new to this. God's self-glorification is the ultimate purpose, which means our redemption is actually subordinate to it.
Yeah, we have to be really clear here. God's own glory is uppermost in his affections. He places a greater value on it than on anything else he has created or done.
And when we say glory, we don't just mean some mystical term.
No, not at all. It's the physical and spiritual manifestation of his infinite worth, the beauty of his perfections. It's the visible display of his infinite greatness.
And God's overwhelming passion, then, is to exalt the value of this glory, to display it, maintain it, and vindicate it from all contempt. If that's true, what does it mean for the goals we usually prioritize, like our own salvation?
It means God's saving designs are, theologically speaking, penultimate, not ultimate. Ultimate means the final thing aimed at. God's final aim is not our salvation, but the display of his own glorious character through our salvation.
So redemption, salvation, restoration. These are all beautiful and necessary steps.
Incredibly so. But they are performed for the sake of something even greater. The sheer delight God has in making his glory known, especially through acts of mercy and justice.
So, if God only saved us, but not for the sake of his own glory, the ultimate purpose would fall short. It wouldn't be aiming at his infinite worth. His own glory is the ultimate reason that contains all the lesser reasons for his actions.
Absolutely. And this brings up the inevitable challenge, which is, why must God be so self-focused? I mean, doesn't this just sound like divine narcissism or vanity?
Yeah, that's the big objection.
And this is where the concept of moral necessity comes in.
Okay, let's unpack that. It's central to the whole argument. We know human vanity is ugly because we're finite, we're defective, and we seek praise to make up for those deficiencies. But God has no deficiencies. So how does moral necessity apply to him?
It applies because God is the one unique being of infinite worth. To value something is to respond appropriately to its excellence. If I find a pebble and a diamond, it's morally right for me to value the diamond infinitely more than the pebble because its objective worth is greater.
Okay, simple enough.
Now, apply that logic to God. God would be unrighteous if he valued anything less than what is supremely valuable. And since he is supremely valuable of infinite worth, he must take infinite delight in his own glory.
So if God valued humanity, or the created universe, more than he valued himself, he would be committing a form of idolatry.
That's it. He would be valuing a finite lesser good above the infinite supreme good.
He'd be worshiping something inferior to himself.
And that's precisely the theological assertion here. God's commitment to himself isn't a defect. It's the ultimate expression of righteousness. It's a moral necessity. It's the only way he can avoid being an idolater. His self-focus is what preserves righteousness in the universe.
And the sources help us understand that self-delight isn't a solitary thing. It's an internal, relational reality within the Godhead, within the Trinity. Before creation, before time, God was eternally and supremely happy.
Yes. We see this intra-Trinitarian delight described in the love between the Father and the Son, which is mediated by the Holy Spirit. The Father delighted in the image of his own glory, which was perfectly represented in the person of the Son.
The Son is described as the exact imprint of God's nature.
Right. This delight is eternal. It doesn't depend on creation. The relationship within the Godhead is one of mutual, infinite enjoyment.
So when the Father says, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased," he's expressing this eternal self-delight.
Exactly. And that means the act of creation, then, it can't be an act of need to acquire glory or happiness. It has to be an act of overflow.
That's a vital point.
It is. The happiness God has in all his works of creation and redemption is just a spillover, an expression of that infinite exuberance for his own excellence. When he creates, he's making an arena where that eternal joy can be displayed and shared. Every good thing he does, every beautiful sunset, every act of salvation is just an echo, a reflection of his pre-existing, self-sufficient delight in himself. He works not because he's lonely or incomplete, but because he's perfectly full and eternally happy.
Okay, but if God is that sovereign and his happiness is that secure, we have to go back to the problem that troubled Edwards so much. How does this sovereignty handle sin and misery? Section 4 really have to tackle the mechanics of how God controls evil.
It does, and the sources confirm that God's sovereignty is comprehensive. It covers calamities, natural disasters, and moral evil. None of his ultimate purposes can be frustrated by Satan, or by the schemes of wicked rulers, or by the disobedience of any sinful person.
The book of Job is a chilling illustration of this, isn't it? Job lost everything, his children, his wealth, his health, and although Satan was the immediate agent causing all of it.
Yeah, right, Satan's the one doing it.
Job's final confession was, "Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?"
Which is incredible piety. He attributed the affliction ultimately to God's hand, even though Satan carried it out. Why? Because Satan only acts by God's permission and under his control. He's on a leash. To say that Satan or sinful people can frustrate God's goals is just to deny his absolute sovereignty. If God reigns, then the evil in the world is not outside his determined plan, even if he's not the one committing the evil himself.
And the clearest, most difficult, and most central example of moral evil fitting into God's design has to be the crucifixion of Christ. Here the source material really focuses on the book of Acts.
Yes, look at the sheer wickedness involved. Judas's betrayal, motivated by greed, the Roman soldiers' brutality, Herod's contemptuous mockery, Pilate's wicked political expediency. These were all acts of moral evil, committed by sinful men exercising their wicked wills. And yet, Acts 4.2728 says that Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, were gathered together to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place.
That verse is staggering. It asserts that the most wicked crime in history, the murder of the Son of God, was done according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. It was planned, foreknown, and then carried out by human rebellion.
And this is where you see the concept in action. People's rebellion against the Most High becomes unwitting service in the wonderful designs of God. They acted freely, sinfully, with full responsibility, and yet their actions served God's predetermined counsel.
Like Joseph's brothers.
The classic illustration. They intended to murder him. Their act of selling him into slavery was pure evil, but God used it for good to preserve numerous people alive.
The distinction still has to be maintained, though. If God decrees that a sinful act happens, how do the sources avoid making God the author of sin? If rebellion gets unwound into service, where's the human guilt in that system?
And that's where Reformed theology is extremely careful. God rules over the disobedience of men, turning it to the purposes he planned, but without mitigating the guilt of the person doing it. God achieves his righteous purposes through the free, culpable choices of men.
Like the hardening of Israel's heart.
A perfect example. It was governed by God so that the Gentiles might receive mercy. The text says God did the hardening, yet Israel was still disobedient and bore the responsibility for it.
Okay, this brings us directly back to Edwards and his resolution. The dual perspective that allows God to be happy despite commanding holiness and permitting sin. We need to look closely at his two lenses, the narrow and the wide angle.
Yes. So the narrow lens is tied to God's will of command. When God looks at a wicked event just on its own, the act of betrayal, the lie, the murder, he views the sin in its inherent ugliness. And viewed that way, he is angered and grieved. It aligns with his express commands, like, I have no pleasure in the death of anyone. God's emotional response to sin in isolation is one of pure abhorrence.
So, through the narrow lens, God sees the suffering, the injustice, and he hates it. That preserves his moral goodness. But the wide-angle lens, which is tied to his will of decree, gives us the necessary context.
Right. The wide-angle lens views the event not in isolation, but in relation to everything leading up to it and everything flowing out of it. This grand, eternal mosaic of redemptive history.
The whole picture.
The whole picture stretching from eternity past to eternity future. And this mosaic, it contains both dark tiles, which is evil, and bright tiles, which is good. The contemplation of the whole thing, the universality, that's what fills God's heart with infinite joy. He permits the evil, the dark tile, only because it contributes to the greater promotion of holiness and the brighter display of his own character in the final overall picture.
So that's the key. God can genuinely hate the sin in the narrow view, but still will its permission in the wide view because of the magnificent outcome it secures for his glory.
He wills the permission of the act while abhorring the wickedness of the act itself. And the death of Christ is the ultimate test case for this. Isaiah writes, "It was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief." God willed the suffering, which he abhorred in the narrow view, but not in the wide view.
Because in the wide view.
In the wide view, the Father saw the cross as the necessary means to show his infinite righteousness and mercy at the same time. The wickedness of the men who drove the nails was abominable, but the resulting vindication of God's justice and the salvation of his people was infinitely magnificent. And that made the ultimate design delightful to the sovereign, happy God.
This brings us logically to section 5, the reconciliation point. If God is perfectly justified and infinitely happy in seeking his own glory, if his self-focus is morally necessary, how does this translate into genuine love for finite, small, deficient creatures like us? This is the point where a lot of people stumble.
It is the great stumbling block, and people have two primary objections to God seeking his own praise. First, as we mentioned, it just smells like human vanity. We dislike second-handers, people who are always fishing for compliments to fill a void. And since we know God needs nothing, his demand for praise can seem strangely manipulative or narcissistic.
And the second objection is specifically biblical, isn't it? We're taught in 1 Corinthians 13.5 that love does not seek its own. So if that's true for us, how can God be love and yet be utterly devoted to seeking his own praise and glory?
Yeah, that's the big one. And the theological resolution has to acknowledge God's unique status. He's not a creature. So the rules of humility and self-effacement that apply to us can't apply in the same way to the Creator. We are not self-sufficient. We have to defer to others. God, however, is the only self-sufficient, all-glorious being. And the sources are assertive about this. He must be for himself if he is to be truly for us.
Because if God stopped valuing what is supremely valuable, which is himself, he'd be denying the infinite worth of his own glory. And if he did that, what hope would we have?
We would lose the very rock of integrity in the universe. If the greatest source of value in reality, God himself, were suddenly found to be valuing something inferior, like us, above himself, then the whole structure of reality would crumble. We couldn't trust his objectivity or his goodness. So the most loving act God can perform for his creatures is to offer them the greatest good.
And since God himself is the only infinite, eternal source of joy,
The most loving thing he can give us to enjoy is himself.
this moves the argument from just defending God's self-focus, showing why it isn't selfish, to actively asserting that God's demand for praise is actually the necessary way to secure our full satisfaction.
Precisely. We need to look at the psychology of enjoyment. You see it everywhere in human experience. Enjoyment spontaneously overflows into praise.
Yeah, that's true.
People praise whatever they value: a winning sports team, a breathtaking piece of music, a spectacular sunrise. We can't help but urge other people to join us in valuing what has captivated our delight.
This is a critical point. The sources suggest that delight is actually incomplete until it's expressed in praise. Praise is the appointed consummation of the enjoyment of something.
That is the ultimate connection. If you enjoy something truly magnificent and you keep that enjoyment silent, you feel this kind of internal tension. The joy requires expression to be fully realized and appreciated. If a musician loves a piece of music, they have to play it. The enjoyment isn't complete until it's expressed.
So if God loves us enough to truly make our joy full, he can't just give us himself, the source of infinite joy, and then let us keep quiet about it. He has to also win from us the praise of our hearts.
Right. If he didn't demand our praise, he would be keeping us from the necessary final step of true human fulfillment.
So God seeks praise, not because he has some deficiency in himself that needs filling.
No, not at all. He seeks praise because he loves us, and he seeks the fullness of our joy, which is found only in actively celebrating and praising the most magnificent being in existence. His purpose is to maximize our enjoyment by bringing us into the proper, passionate response to infinite beauty.
And this is where the paradox just dissolves entirely. The conclusion is inescapable. God's pursuit of praise from us and our pursuit of pleasure in him
Or the same pursuit. They are two sides of the same glorious coin. It's the heart of the great gospel message. When God relentlessly pursues his own glory and praise, he is simultaneously preserving and offering the only thing in all the world that can completely satisfy our deepest longings: himself. He is for us because, and only because, he is absolutely for himself.
This has been a monumental exploration of these theological truths. So, to recap, we started with the profound personal wrestling of Jonathan Edwards, who saw the doctrine of sovereignty shift from something horrible to something sweet.
And we established that God's absolute sovereignty is the mechanism that guarantees his infinite joy, because none of his purposes can be frustrated.
And that joy is secured by his infinite excellence, his glory, which he values above all else. Because God is the supreme good, he must value himself infinitely, which means his self-glorification is the greatest good for the entire created order.
Then we faced the tough reality of sin and misery, and we saw that God controls even moral evil through those dual perspectives of command and decree to form this magnificent overall redemptive mosaic.
And finally, we saw the complete reconciliation of God's self-focus with true love. God commands our praise because it's the appointed consummation of our joy in him. His pursuit of his glory and our pursuit of lasting satisfaction are one and the same goal.
I will leave you with a final thought to carry with you. We've shown that God's self-delight overflows into all his works of creation and salvation. But you should recognize the profound implication of that overflow. God's climax of happiness is realized not just in the initial act of doing good, but in the delight he takes in the echoes of his excellence and the praises of his people. So think about your worship, your satisfaction, your rejoicing, as the very sound that brings joy to the sovereign, eternally happy heart of God himself.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the source material. We will see you next time on The Deep Dive.